Good evening, everybody. Hey, how are you? How are you? My name is Kim Ryder. I'm Director of Operations here at the Wayne Theater, and on behalf of our staff, our amazing ambassadors, and our board of directors, we welcome you here tonight. Thanks again for being here. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about a few things that are happening here at the Wayne. Thursday night, we have the 6-string Army Band that'll be here right on the stage. It's going to be a hoot. It's going to be great. Pay What You Will event, so whatever you want to do, just come on down and listen to some great music. Actually, I understand that Craig Morgan, I don't know if you know him, will be there as well. That's going to be great. On Friday night, we have Son of a Gun, which is a Guns N' Roses tribute band, the tribute band, and they will be here on Friday night. Starting next week, you may have noticed the little 9 to 5 stuff in the lobby. We're going to be doing our run of 9 to 5. That is next weekend and the weekend after, Friday night, Saturday matinee, Saturday night, and Sunday matinee. So you have 8 chances to see that one. It's going to be really great. Also, we have our Studio Wayne classes, our summer classes and camps are all on our website. We're doing a summer movie series on Wednesday morning and Wednesday afternoon. So keep you cool during the summer for anybody that would like to attend that. It's always a lot of fun. So without further ado, here is Tom Benzing.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to the Wayne Theater for hosting our Science Speaker Series. I also want to recognize our other sponsors, the Center for Cold Waters Restoration, the South River Watershed Coalition, and the Virginia Museum of Natural History. And for those that are following along with the story about bringing a campus of the Virginia Museum of Natural History to Waynesboro, we will be participating in Riverfest. You may have noticed the trailer in Constitution Park. It is now fully wrapped with our insignia, and we will be opening that during all of Riverfest, and then we plan to have that regularly open on Saturdays during the farmers market. So come and see us and learn more about what's going on with that initiative. Tonight is our last speaker for this season's series, so I would also encourage you, if you have ideas, our upcoming series will start in September again. We'll take the summer off. And if you have ideas for speakers, please let us know. Any one of us in the room that serve on those boards, in particular, Jenna Connizer and Hal Alistad, Max Quillen, Irby Nash, or myself. We'd appreciate your ideas, and we've gotten some really good ones from the audience in the past. So I encourage you to share thoughts with us on that. Our speaker tonight is Cole Young, and he's going to be talking about a really interesting topic, and I'm really excited about the fact that we're going to hear about wildfires because, as you know, we had an interesting wildfire season last fall, and we're already starting off with an interesting season this year. So one of the challenges to bring somebody to talk about wildfires at this time of year is that there are active wildfires, and so he can get called away at the last minute. So I'm very happy that Cole is able to join us. Cole Young graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in wildlife conservation and a minor in forestry. He started his career with the Department of Conservation and Recreation in their Natural Heritage program, and then moved to the Department of Forestry, and he's been there about 5 years. I understand he is a native of Augusta County, and in fact, he and his wife live on a farm just outside of Churchville. So please join me in welcoming Cole Young, who'll be talking about wildland fire and prescribed burning in Virginia.
Can you guys hear me? Yes, sir. All right. Well, thank you all for having me this afternoon. Appreciate you all coming out and spending some of your free time to learn about some of the things that we do, some things that I get to do as my job. So I'll just kind of dive into it. So a little bit about me. Like they said, I was born and raised right here in good old Augusta County, Churchville. Went to Buffalo Gap High School. So born and raised, always wanted to go out and get back home to work. So it was always a goal of mine to get back, work out in nature for my home. So went to school, graduated. Not long after that, I got into natural resources, working for the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And that's really when I started my fire career. So I didn't have a whole lot of background in fire until I started a full-time job, or a part-time job actually with DCR. So yeah, my fire background isn't super long, but to some it seems like ages, and some it's not. But I also cover Highland County as well, so Augusta and Highland are my two main areas, and we cover them for a variety of different services, including prescribed burning and wildfire. And there's only two of us for the two counties, so we're spread pretty thin, and we're actually just a small portion of a larger work area that covers pretty much the entire Shenandoah Valley. So depending on the day and which way the wind's blowing is really going to depend on where I might end up that day. And the agency that I work for is the Virginia Department of Forestry, not to be confused with the U.S. Forest Service. We're very similar agencies, and we do a lot of the same things. The main big difference is that our agency, the Virginia Department of Forestry, deals with private landowners and state-owned property. So if you have a fire on your property, or you're interested in prescribed burning, or really any of the other items that are up there, call us. We're the guys that are going to come out. The U.S. Forest Service, they just kind of mainly deal with their own property, national forests, the George Washington and Jefferson areas, and then they assist us as we need it. So yeah, other than fire, these other 5 things are all part of what I do. So people ask me all the time, what is it that you do? And I tell them it depends on the day. This time of year, we're in full swing of fire season, doing some prescribed burnings. Other times of year, we may be doing forest management. Our agency inspects logging jobs for sedimentation and protection of water quality. We do a lot of public outreach events, presentations, school events, Smoky Bear programs. There's tons and tons of different programs and things that we do. So if you have a question and it's got anything to do with a tree, give me a call and I'll see if I can help you out. But let's dive into what you guys sort of came to listen to me ramble about, wildland fire. People always say, we don't have fires in Virginia. Like, that's a Western thing. Well, I'm here to tell you that they're wrong. So the picture that's up here is actually a fire that I was on a couple years ago. It was called the Hogback Fire, and it was in Rockbridge County, so just to the south of us in the Goshen WMA, if anybody knows where that's at. This fire was all said and done. It was about 1,700 acres by the time we finished wrapping it up. And this is one of my favorite pictures, because if you look closely, you can see there's a little white speck up there that's not really part of the main edge of the fire, right? Can y'all see that from down there? Yeah? So that little white speck isn't actually part of the fire. That's one of our suppression dozers out there putting in line, trying to stop that fire from backing down the mountain and impacting some houses. So, when we talk about wildland fire, we got to start with the basics, right? So we'll go back a little bit, pretty much all the way to elementary school. So there's 3 things that a fire needs to burn. Does anybody want to take a stab at what the 3 things are? Oxygen, heat, so an ignition source, and fuel. That's right. So those are 3 basic things. It's the fire triangle. Without one of them, the fire will not be able to burn. And they all really depend on each other. So if you take one away, the fire's going to go out. So the problem with oxygen is you can't really take it away, because we sort of need it to breathe so that we can actually put the fire out. And a lot of times we think a fire, we think of big fire engines, structural fires pulling up, and they're dumping gallons and gallons, thousands of gallons on a structure to kind of try and put it out, because they're trying to save what's burning. And then what they're targeting there is the heat. They're trying to remove that heat, remove any kind of ignition source that might hold over and get it put out. So when it comes to wildfires, we run into a couple issues with that strategy. One of the main issues is the size. So even a big house, is only a couple hundred or a couple thousand square feet. You get into a wildfire that is even 20 acres or 100 acres or 1,000 acres. You think about 1,000 football fields or 2,000 football fields put together. That's a big area. It's hard to get water to all those areas. Another challenge is that wildfires tend to move around. They're not a stationary object. So depending on the wind, the weather, other factors, that thing can move and change directions. So the strategy that we use primarily for wildfire suppression is we target the fuel. So that's why we use hand tools, bulldozers. If we can remove the fuel from the active fire edge, essentially when the fire gets there, there's nothing left for it to burn and it'll go out. So that's kind of the basics of what the objectives are when we're looking at fire suppression, wildland fire suppression. So there's another cool triangle that we're going to talk about, and that's the fire behavior triangle. So topography, weather, and fuels are the three main factors that influence fire spread, fire activity, and fire occurrence. And they all, again, depend on each other. They all influence each other, and they change how a fire is going to interact. So we'll look at the fuels. So you can kind of break them down into different size classes, right? So your fuel types, you kind of break them down into like grasses, shrubs, small trees and twigs, and then you've got larger stuff, larger diameter trees, and they all burn differently, and they all dry out differently. So the amount of moisture that's in them, which is shown by these 1 hour, 10 hour, 100,000 hour fuels, is essentially depicting how quick it takes for something to burn up. And that means the less time it takes for them to dry out, the more likely they are to catch fire. So in Virginia, we have a few different types of fuel classes, but the main one that we have here in the valley are going to be kind of your grasses. So down in the valley, hay fields, think of the pasture, we have a lot of grasses. And then you get into the mountains, we have timber, hardwood, litter, understory. So those are the two main kind of fuel types that we have here. And then our fuel moistures really vary. So they tell us a lot. They tell me a lot when I look into that information, and I know that we're going to start seeing some pretty active fire when our 100-hour fuels really start to get really dry. When those fuel moisture levels get really low, that's when we see a really big increase in fire activity. Things that wouldn't typically burn start to burn. The next thing is topography. So the way that the land lays, the way that the features and the landscape interact with the fire. A fire is going to interact with the landscape completely differently depending on where you're standing. So if you go out to the eastern portion of our state where it's relatively flat, the fire activity is going to kind of be consistent all the way around the fire. Versus you get here into the mountains, our fire tends to want to go up. It's always going to go upslope, and it's always going to burn more intensely going upslope than it will going downslope. So topography is a huge factor in influencing the way that fires burn. And when I was learning about wildfire, they kept talking about these things called canyons. And I was like, we don't have any canyons. Well, around here we call them hollows. We got plenty of hollows. So a fire is going to interact with a hollow pretty differently. And the topography will also influence the fuels. So what grows on a certain slope or faces a certain direction is going to change on the way the land lays. The last thing that really influences fire behavior is the weather. And that one's probably the most influential factor because it tends to change. Around here, it seems like it changes every couple hours or every couple minutes. And weather can be viewed on a large scale or on a small scale. So you can look at it at a day-by-day thing. You can look at it seasonally. Our weather that we have here in the spring is a lot different than what we have in the winter and the fall or the summer. And it really influences our fire growth. All the time, it seems this time of year, you're getting notifications on your phone for fire weather watches or red flag warnings and all of that stuff that you might get a special weather statement for an increased risk of fire today. That's all based on weather. That means that the weather conditions are just right that an increased risk of fire spread may happen. So some of the weather conditions that we really look for are these right here. So a big one that tells us a lot and that we tend to kind of look at as an indicator is the relative humidity. So the humidity essentially is a measure of the amount of moisture that's available in the air. And this time of year, you go outside, who has ever felt their hands get really dry or they'll start to crack? Or this time of year, you're always reaching in your pocket for chapstick, right? Your lips are getting chapped. That's a result of low humidity. So when that humidity gets low, moisture starts to move out of things into the air because it always wants to equalize. So it does the same thing to our lips as it does to fuels. So when it pulls that moisture out of those fuels, it continues to dry them out and continue to dry them out. Another thing, of course, is the wind. I think we all know about that one, right? High winds mean that the fire is going to spread in the direction that it's blowing. And it may be fast. And around here in the mountains, our winds are never the same. You may go across Afton Mountain, and the wind's blowing like crazy, and then as soon as you get to the bottom at the 96 exit, the winds are completely different. And they change when they're influenced by some of the other features like the topography. They may be upslope during the warm parts of the day, and then they'll die off at night. Precipitation, of course, the amount of rain that we get, and the duration between rain. So, for instance, we got a pretty good rainstorm a couple days ago, right? Some people got an inch of rain. Our neighbors to the west in Highland County got close to 3 inches. Well, I've been on 2 different wildfires today, so it's definitely still dry. It doesn't take much for these weather factors to really dry out the fuels after a rain. So that's a big one. And then another one that took me a while to wrap my head around was atmospheric instability or unstable air. So we get a lot of that this time of year. So when you walk out of your house in the mornings on your way to work or class, and you look up and you're like, man, this is a beautiful spring day. There's blue sky. The wind's breezy a little bit. It's not humid out. Well, when I walk out of the door, I think those things, and the very next thought is, man, it's going to be a fiery day today, because all those factors really play into each other. So clear blue skies mean that there's a higher risk of fires. When it's really cloudy out, the weather doesn't seem to be as drastic or changed. It's kind of like a blanket holding everything in. So yeah, those are the basics. You guys are all now certified wildland firefighters. Congratulations. I'll be calling you up here in the next couple days. But yeah, all these factors really play on each other, and they're all dependent on each other. If you take one of those legs away, the system really changes. And I think it's important to think about the system as a whole. So we have the fire itself, right? And then we have the fires that influence on a landscape scale. And then even larger than that, we have the historic fire regimes and what the fire did in the past. All those things really depend on each other, and they change over time. It seems like this year it's been a little windier and drier than the previous years, right? And talking about that, this is our report from last year. So our reports run from July 1 to July 1, and this is the 2023 report. You can see that the acres that burned in the 2023 year are down. You know, we went down to 7,000 acres. That's still a lot of acres, but for the whole state, that's pretty good. And I know that this next round that's coming up will be from July 1 to 2024. Well, we had one fire this spring that was 7,000 acres in the Shenandoah Valley. So it's really, really dependent, and it can change drastically. And yeah, people who say we don't have big fires in Virginia, you can look at the history and show that, 300,000 acres burned at one point in time, and even down to like 2,000 acres. So it changes. Our fire seasons, so we actually have 2 of them. The most notable one is the one we're in right now, so our spring fire season. We all know about the 4 p.m. law that we have here in Virginia to reduce the amount of outdoor burning until after 4 p.m. But the reasons that we have fire seasons And the reason that they're in the spring and the fall really depend on those behavior factors, right? So our fuel moistures are low. In the winter, the leaves come off the tree, and then all winter long, they dry out. They lay on the ground just like a chunk of firewood would do, and it dries out and it becomes cured. We tend to have lower humidities or multiple days of low humidities, so further drying. We tend to have wind. What they always say, one of the months comes in like a lamb and goes out like a lion. So all the wind is a huge thing. And a little bit of differences between the two seasons. Our fall tends to be not quite as intense as our spring season. And that is because the factors are similar, but they're sort of opposite. In the fall, the leaves come off the trees, they still have some moisture, and they start to dry out, versus the spring, they've already had that time to dry out. Another thing is the days are getting shorter in the fall, so there's less time for the sun to dry out fuels, versus the spring, the days are getting longer. It gets colder at night instead of warmer. All those things kind of factor into each other. So, common causes of wildfires in Virginia. The only natural cause we have is lightning. And we do have some lightning strike fires. They aren't very, very common, and usually they happen at odd times of the year. If we get really dry in the summer, when we have a lot of thunderstorms, late spring, if it's still really dry, we'll start to get some lightning strike fires. They're usually a beast to tackle at times. But the main cause are man-made fires. So the leading cause is debris burning. And that doesn't necessarily mean somebody's out here burning trash all the time. It can happen for anything. People like to burn leaves. A windstorm comes through and blows their leaves away. You got some fence rows that you cleared off at your house, and you want to kind of get them cleaned up. You know, there's tons of different things that it means by debris burning. It's not always just somebody burning trash. Some of the other causes: arson, power lines, vehicle accidents. I see a lot of things start along the interstate this time of year, people dragging chains. There's tons and tons of different causes. There's a few that aren't up there. Equipment. I've seen a few fires caused by chainsaws. I've seen fires caused by four-wheelers that get bunched up leaves underneath them when they're taking a ride in the afternoon. A big one that we see kind of early in the season are wood stove ashes. So people go out, they clean out their wood stove, and they dump them in the same spot that they've dumped them their entire time they've lived in their house, and the conditions are just right that a little ember is still burning in there. It gets out and starts a wildfire. So there's tons of different causes. Unfortunately, 90 to 95% are all man-made causes. So the 4 p.m. law, all those factors we just talked about play into this law, right? So being that our main causes for fire are human-related, and that the spring is kind of our highest risk, that's kind of the science behind this law. This law has been around for a really, really long time. It's been around since the 1940s. So when people tell me, when I go up to them and ask them if they knew about the 4 p.m. law and they tell me no, I usually kind of look at them a little sideways, because this law is way older than I am, so it's been around a while. And I think it shows it works because it's been around this so long, and there's science that proves that it works. So it's a restriction on open air burning. It restricts burning until after 4 p.m. And the reason that it restricts it till after 4 p.m. is that after 4 p.m. or later in the afternoons, conditions begin to improve. So humidities tend to be coming up. Winds at night will die down. They sort of lay down at night. So that's sort of why it's put off until the afternoon. Does that mean that at 4 p.m. there's a magic switch that prevents all wildfires from starting? No, not at all. I go to plenty of fires that are after 4 p.m. or even after dark sometimes. So it's not a magic bullet, but it does help. So please obey the laws. And if you do find yourself burning before 4 p.m., it is a Class 3 misdemeanor, so it is a ticketable offense. So next, we'll kind of talk about what we do when we go to a wildfire. So there's a couple different tactics that we use, and you can divide them up into two main categories. So the main tactic that we use for wildfire suppression is direct attack. So that is when we go out and there's a fire and we're right on the edge of it. So you're building line, maybe a foot off of the active flame edge. You're in there, it's hot. Flame lengths can vary. Maybe it's a 1 foot or 2 foot flame lengths. So, you may be waist high flames. You can still be in there kind of putting in some line, putting in good work. And that's sort of the main tactic that we use here. So the idea with direct attack is to keep everything as small as possible. And we have the ability to do that here most of the time. The caveat is most of the time. So every now and then, things don't work out for direct attack. Maybe the topography is difficult for people to access. It's hard to get into. It's hard to reach. Maybe we have a day like we had this March where the winds are blowing 40, 50 miles an hour, and we're seeing 10-foot flame lengths coming off of leaf litter. So stuff that would usually burn 1 to 2 flame lengths is burning 4, 5, 10 feet. So you just can't physically get in there and work safely. So the tactic that we'll always I'll call it plan B, is to go indirect. And that's when we kind of back off of the edge and we use things like natural features. So you may go find a road and use that as your fire break. You may use like a ridge top, natural features or man-made features that we know are good, solid fire breaks. And generally, that's when we get to see the big fires here in Virginia. So in a situation where we can't physically get in and do the work on the ground, we start to go indirect. And that is where we start to get into doing operations like backfiring or backburning. So backburning, essentially, is the intentional set of a fire along a constructed fire line. And I get a question a lot is, well, why would you set a fire when you're trying to put the fire out? And you even hear this term, fight fire with fire. Well, this is where it comes from. The whole idea with lighting a backfire, again, goes back to what we initially talked about, removing that fuel. So if we can burn it, we can burn the fuel that's adjacent to our line, that essentially widens our line by removing that fuel source. So we always burn when conditions are beneficial. So whenever we do backburn, there's some planning that goes into it and some techniques that we use to make sure that the fire is protective and beneficial and not, we're not setting a second fire right next to an already big fire. But yeah, that's the main reason that we backfire, is to consume the available fuel. And fires will tend to burn into each other, so when they pull together, that's what we want. Puts black to our edge, which is ideal. Another thing we'll talk about a little bit is the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, because everything in the fire department has an acronym, the WUI. So the WUI is that zone that everybody wants to live in, right? It's where everybody seems to want to build their houses, up in the woods, because we all want to be close to nature. And a great example of this, if we look back at our fire history, is Gatlinburg, Tennessee. A couple years ago, they had some pretty devastating fires out there, and that's a great representation of what the wildland urban interface is. It's when that zone of people kind of combines with the wilderness. And if you choose to live in one of those places or do anything like that, it is a higher risk. It's a higher risk for fires to start. It's a higher risk for property damage. It's definitely a risk. So if you do live in an area that is prone to fires, or you want to kind of mitigate the risks to damage to your property from fire, you want to create a defensible space or green space kind of around your home. And you can see in that picture on the right, or I guess your guys' left, there's a couple houses in there. There's multiple houses in there, and one survived, but the one right next to it didn't. And you can see that house that has the green space around it has that defensible space. So it's important to enjoy the nature and live in it like you want, but it's also important to protect your home. So every year, check over your property, check around your home, clean out your flower beds from leaves that build up over the winter, clean out your gutters, try not to store a bunch of flammable firewood or something maybe on your front porch. There's tons of different things that you can do. So that being said, we'll look at this this house, right? So this is a structure that was protected on a wildfire that happened this spring. We're pretty lucky that it got protected, right? You can see that there's tons of leaf or needle cast on top of the roof. There's some plywood leaning up against it. There's actually a propane tank kind of right underneath of it. And even you'll notice that the bottom of that building is open. So over the winter, material can blow up underneath there, and if in the event of a fire and an ember gets into those leaves that have built up underneath that structure, it can definitely cause the loss of that structure. So not the best defensible space, right? So this is the neighbor's house, and you can actually, I don't know if you can see it that well from back there, but you can actually see the fire's edge kind of on the left hand of the screen, and all that green space. So that fire actually burned all the way down to the edge of his yard. But we had space to get people in there. We had the ability to use fire engines to protect houses. That's what you want. That's kind of an extreme example, but that's the idea, right? So, my main man, Smokey Bear. He's always talking about fire prevention. Smokey, he knows. He's been around. He's done it for a long time. So always check the weather. If you're building campfires, make sure they're out cold. Check them. Check your vehicles. Be fire aware. Be safe. Anything that you think could cause a fire can in the right conditions. So always listen to Smokey. So now we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about some prescribed burning. So what is prescribed burning? Well, it's the controlled application of fire to an ecosystem that benefits from fire. And I know somebody's out here thinking, well, he just talked about why we should stop fires. Why are we setting fires back? And the key to that is in there. It's fire-dependent ecosystems. So if we take that information and we look at our history, we know that people haven't been around forever, but lightning's been around forever. So even before people, we still had fires that occurred on the landscape, right? So if a lightning strike may start a fire, it may burn until the fuels go out. Maybe it burns till it rains. So before people, fires occurred pretty naturally, randomly, but naturally. And then it's also believed that Native Americans used fire as a tool to clear land. Some folks believe that Native Americans would use up an area to its completion, and then as they'd leave, they'd set fire to it, and then when they came back in the spring or the next year or something, that the fire had rejuvenated the landscape and that it was all green again. So fire is a part of where we live, and there's other evidence out there of our species that once lived here that show that. So things like the American chestnut, they believe that thrived the way that it did because of the fire that was here. That fire kind of created the correct ecosystem, the correct environment for those trees to thrive. So, a little bit more about the history, the fire ecology. We're in a regime that is relatively low intensity, infrequent fires. So, in this map that you saw up here, the red color basically says that we had fires here every kind of 10-ish years. We had some sort of fire between, in the 1600s, that time frame. So about every 10 years, we were seeing some sort of fire. So we want to recreate that with prescribed burning. That's the whole idea, right? And then, as much as I love Smokey Bear, when he came around in the 1900s, what'd Smokey say? Prevent wildfires, right? And that's great. But what Smokey didn't think about was the benefits that fires have on the landscape. So when we stopped lighting fires, we really limited a lot of the species that use fire as a benefit, fire species that are adapted. We also prevented fires which caused a lot of fuel loading. So areas that fuels would be burned off every couple of years didn't have that. So they would build up for years and years and years, and we had big, large, intense wildfires on the landscape. So, fire-adapted species. Oaks, a lot of our oaks are fire-adapted. They have thick bark. That's a characteristic of being fire adapted. Things that have thin bark like maples or poplars, they're not made to withstand fire. They have thin bark. Our table mountain pine or pitch pine, they're all fire adapted or fire dependent species. They've kind of developed these characteristics that make them thrive when it moves through an area. And there's tons of other grasses and forbs that are really dependent on that as well. So fire would clear out the underbrush, open up the ground to new seeds, and a lot of plants capitalize on that. So that's some of the benefits, right? It reduces the risk of big wildfires. If we can reduce the amount of fuel that's present, it's a benefit. The fire that burned this year in Luray, it actually burned into a prescribed burn that was done several weeks beforehand. If it hadn't, that fire could have been twice or 3 times as big. So prescribed burning is definitely a tool to mitigate some wildfire risks. It removes thick underbrush. It exposes the soil. It brings more light to the ground. All these things that benefit plants. But then that also benefits the wildlife. If new plants can grow, or maybe more space is available for plants to get larger, they can produce more fruits, more seeds, more stems, more things that birds, insects, wildlife eat. So it's a huge, huge benefit. And this is a picture of a burn that was done in Augusta County, actually. And you can sort of tell the road in the center is what we used as our fire break. On the left-hand side, all the leaf litter, a lot of big, heavy underbrush. On the right, it was burned probably, I think, about 3 weeks before I took this picture. And the species that were in there were completely different. On the burned area, there was a ton of American chestnut seedlings coming up. You could walk through there every couple steps and find those seedlings, oak seedlings, all the things that we want to promote, were there. Versus you walked across the street and you didn't see those. You didn't see the seedlings. You didn't see the germination, the growth. A lot of, even in the fire areas, things that were kind of dead or dying or declining, they started to stump sprout. So that's more stems, more browse for animals. So, what goes into a burn? A lot. Contrary to popular belief, we don't just walk out into the woods with a drip torch and a match and just start slinging fire around. It takes hours, days, weeks, months of planning, depending on how big of a burn is. All the burns that we do go through an approval process, so we have to submit plans that outline every aspect of that burn. The goals, why are we burning? How many people is it going to take? How long is it going to take? What are you going to do if this happens? What are you going to do if that happens? So there's a ton of planning that goes into it. And in the spring, we do have the ability to burn before 4 p.m., but we have to go through a separate approval process for that. We have to get an exemption. So we submit even more paperwork and more approval to get that exemption to be able to burn before the law will allow us. And we have to have a special certification to do that. So just like our fire seasons, when we burn something is going to create different effects. So a dormant season burn that's done in the late fall or winter into the early spring is going to have a different effect than something that's done when it starts to green up. Dormant seasons won't really kill a lot of hardwoods, but it's great to remove that litter layer that's down on the ground. It's great for exposing the soil without causing a whole lot of damage. And it's a tool that we use a lot when we manage for warm season grasses or pollinator forb species. We can do dormant season burns on those, and once the growing season begins, they resprout. The growing season burn, which is done once the plants kind of start to come back to life in the spring, once the green up starts, we're getting into that growing season time now, right? We're starting to see things green up, but it's not too green. The growing season burning is a whole lot more finicky because it's so touchy. We go through a pretty quick green up process here in Virginia, so it's kind of a really tight window when we do growing season burns. A lot of those burns we'll kind of try and do in the fall. And they're more adept at killing hardwood species. So if you want to maybe thin out a stand, maybe you have a hardwood stand that you want to kind of try and thin out or change the species composition. Maybe you have a lot of maple in it. You want to promote white oaks or different species. You can tailor when you burn to what you want to get out of it. Growing season burns tend to create more canopy gaps and make more space on the forest floor. So, once we figured out what we want to do, once we figured out our objectives and when we want to burn, now it's time to do the work. So now we got to prep the unit. So that can mean a ton of different things. A lot of times when we do our unit preps, we try and use natural features. We try not to create more unnatural features on the landscape when we don't have to. We can use natural features that are there, roads, ridges, other things like that, but not all the time. So sometimes we do have to create new fire breaks, and they can really depend. That picture up there was maintained as like a clover, so we didn't really have to do a whole lot of work to it. It was good to go. So we can use green grass to burn off of. It's an acceptable fire break. Another big thing that we do when we prep for burns is a lot of chainsaw work. So standing dead stuff, things that might fall, threaten the line. If there's a lot of big heavy trees kind of right on the edge of what we're trying to burn, we want to move those away, move them interior. So a lot of prep work goes into it, a lot of planning. The next thing, the weather. Here we go, we talk about the weather again. Weather is such a huge factor. So the weather is going to influence how that unit burns. It's going to influence how we implement the burn, because we want to burn it in a way that gets the benefits of a wildfire without the risk of it burning up everything like a wildfire. So we look at the wind direction, temperatures, humidity, all those things play into it. Things like warm season grasses are great to burn maybe 1 or 2 days after a rain. Things like hardwood understory, it might take a week for it to dry out enough to burn. So that's a big part of the planning, but it's also very time sensitive. So it's that hurry up and wait mindset. We may have planned it out for 3 weeks, and then we might get a window on Monday. So on Sunday, we're all scrambling around trying to get things together. So it's a really kind of time-sensitive thing when we're kind of planning these burns. And then we also continue to monitor the weather throughout the burn, because it's going to change throughout the day. We might start burning at 11 when the humidity's kind of high, but by 3 or 4 o'clock, the humidity's low, the fire activity's gone up. The wind might change directions throughout the day. So we have to continue to monitor things and be prepared to make adjustments on the fly. So now, the fun part. All of our aspects lined up, all of our windows are right, we've got all the people and all the plans and everything, all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. It's time to do some burning. So, day of the burn, we all get together and we talk it out. We tell everybody how we're going to do it, what our plans are, what our firing operations are going to be, where all the lines are, if there's contingency plans, what those are. And then we start with a test fire. So essentially we start burning. And if our test fire doesn't give us what we want, we adjust. So maybe the fire doesn't burn hot enough on our test fire, so we might wait a little bit, give the fuels more time to dry out. Or if we light a test fire and it's really intense and we don't want that, we can stop. That's the whole purpose of the test fire. So that's the fun part, right? Everybody likes to sling around a torch and set things on fire. But then the not so fun part is the mop up and the monitoring. So once we light it and we get it all burned out, it still takes us hours or days to monitor and mop up and make sure things are out. Like I said in the wildfire section, different fuels burn differently and they hold heat differently. So I've been to plenty of burns where you go back the next day and you think that it's all out cold, and there's a stump that wasn't smoking 2 days ago. It's starting to smoke now. So it's never simple. But the plan is to take something like this, which is a warm season grass patch, add some fire to it, turn it into something like this, which a lot of people call it the moonscape, right? If you ever walked through a burn, it's kind of like walking on the moon. It's just kind of black and it's kind of dusty at your feet. I really like this picture because on the left side you can see it all looked the same, right? But we were able to use our dozer, our lines, and the weather conditions to exclude certain areas. So if those lines weren't there, all those areas would have burned the same. So this landowner, he wanted to let those let those areas grow up in trees, and he didn't want to have some tree patches. So you do the burn, it looks like a moonscape out there, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, it looks like this. So all those grasses that were black, and maybe you thought they were dead, the right conditions show up, it's beautiful green again. So it's a great tool. New technology. So this is something that we've started to use here in Virginia is drones. So we actually have 3 drones in Virginia that are equipped with systems to do aerial ignitions. So we can go out, plan out a burn with a drone. Somebody can sit at their truck and push buttons and set the whole thing on fire in a matter of 10 minutes. Something that would have taken all day to burn, now we can do with half the manpower and a whole lot safer. And we can also use it to monitor our people. We can use it to monitor things. It doesn't have to be burning, right? We can use the thermal imaging to check for hot spots. Maybe we would have caught that stump that was smoking on that second day a little sooner if we had a drone to kind of check out those hot spots. So just like everything, technology is new and always advancing. It's a really cool tool. So I think Virginia is one of the largest states to have a drone program. I'm actually a drone pilot, so I can go out and fly that drone and set things on fire whenever they call me. So a couple other notes. Again, prescribed burning's it's a tool in a toolbox. I've heard some people say, why use a sledgehammer when you need a screwdriver? Sometimes that fire can be that sledgehammer. Sometimes it can be that screwdriver. So you want to use prescribed burning when it's necessary. You want to use it as a tool. It's not a magic bullet. You don't go out and just burn something once and expect the whole landscape or the world to change around you. A lot of times burns take several years, and we don't burn things every year. We burn them on a cycle. It might be 3 to 5 years before we burn the same area again, because that's what the natural history, the natural regime was, right? That's what we want to mimic. So it's not a magic bullet. It's not a one-time out there, everything's better now. So if you're thinking about burning, keep that in mind, that it's a commitment. It's not a one-time thing. As for fires, Smokey says it best, only you can prevent wildfires. So always monitor the weather. We all have that magic crystal ball in our pockets we can pull out, and it'll tell us what the weather's going to do that day and for the future. So always check your weather if you're going to plan on burning. If there is a wildfire, call 911 first. There's only 2 of us in Augusta and Highland County, so it takes us a while to get places sometimes. So 911 is your best option. And if there is a fire, please give people space. It's dangerous. There's trees coming down. There's equipment. There's people running all over the roads. It's a dangerous place. So give people space to work and move to a safe location. And that's all I've got. So thank you guys for having me, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Cole, and we will take some questions. Just a reminder, we are live streaming this, so if you do have a question, just wait for a microphone so everybody can hear you.
Thanks for the microphone. I have a little bit of a laryngitis. I have 2 questions. One is, I think you've indicated that you're not just doing this on public land, you're also doing it on privately owned land.
That's correct, yes.
That's what I was wondering. What is the minimum size for a controlled burn?
Minimum size, there's not really any control. There's no minimum size. So I've burned things as small as 1 acre, half acre, 1/10 acre. There's no real size limit as long as the objectives are good. That's kind of the key. We want to burn for a good reason and not just burning to burn. So that's more important than the size. There's benefits to all sizes of burns.
I'm wondering where the manpower and resources specifically come from to fight both a smaller fire and a really large fire.
I didn't catch the first part of that question. You said
Where the manpower and resources come to fight the fires.
that's a great question. So the manpower and resources come from all over the place. So we're a state agency. So when we start to have big fires, we'll start calling in resources from all over the state. So we'll have crews from Eastern Virginia come up. If they can, crews from Southwest Virginia. We'll start pulling those in together. But we also have a small crew here locally that they're kind of like volunteers. They're part-time, so we pay them. But they kind of volunteer their time for a small paycheck to come out and help us. And so all it takes is a phone call. And I may call some of our part-timers and say, hey, I've got a fire in Waynesboro, can you come? And hopefully they'll show up. So that's what we depend on most days is our volunteers or part-times folks.
How many fires do you think happen each year in Augusta County?
How many fires they have each year in Augusta County? That's a good question. It really, really depends. It depends, again, on the season. Last year, we had not very many. I don't necessarily keep track with exact numbers we have per county, but it really depends. If it's really dry, we'll have more. If it's really wet, we won't have very many. So it's dependent.
You mentioned some of the benefits of having fires, and one that I've heard about that you didn't mention, but I think it maybe came out when they were doing a lot of the research about fires in Yellowstone, was that it releases nutrients. So when the trees are mature, they lock up all the nutrients, and when you burn the fire, then that actually releases it to the soil and to newer plants. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's a great point. So prescribed burning is a great way to release some nutrients back into the soil. As he said, plants lock it up. As they grow, they suck up those nutrients, but burning it releases them, puts, nitrogen and available resources back into the soil and helps our plants grow.
A couple questions, but first, thanks for being here and all the information. When there's a big fire and that fire is burning in state land, in national forest, on private land, who's in charge? What department is in charge of that fire?
So it can depend. Ideally, we try and do things as a unified command, so we all kind of share ownership because we all have a stake in things, right? So we want to share the responsibility. Every agency has knowledge that maybe another one doesn't. So we typically try and run things as a unified command. When it gets really, really large scale, that becomes a little more difficult. So we'll maybe move to something a little less unified, but we still continue to take input from all the parties.
The burns that you do on private land, do you get compensated for doing them?
I get paid in sunsets.
But the landowner doesn't get charged by the state for you to come out and burn 100 acres of their property.
So for us to burn, there is a fee. It's $25 an acre.
Okay.
There's tons of cost share and other programs out there that will help offset those costs. And sometimes you might fall into the right program and we do get to burn for free.
And does the county itself, county government help compensate in any way or coordinate with you with their fire volunteer departments or their rescue and fire squads?
For prescribed burning?
Well, any of it.
So not necessarily for prescribed burning, but definitely for fire response. So like I said, calling 911, those volunteers or those county resources, they're usually the first ones there. Yeah. So when they get there, we want to become unified command, work with them, use their resources, in areas that maybe they don't have the expertise. Like we can use our equipment to go into the wilderness where the volunteers or fire departments can have structural engines and do point protection, structure protection. So yes, it's a very, interweaved, intertwined community.
One last question. What do we need to be thinking about in the next couple of years to confront what could be the changing environment here with wildfires?
That's a good question. I think for me, the interface that we have, that it continues to grow, that middle ground between urban areas and those woodland home communities, those are things that as our counties grow, as populations grow, those are going to become more prevalent, and those are high risk areas. So those are the things to me that we need to be kind of pretty conscious about.
Hello. I was wondering how you use prescribed fires to take out invasive species of plants.
That's a good question. So
Thank you.
prescribed burning and invasive species can be challenging. Invasive species aren't invasive for no reason, right? So they're pretty tough. They're pretty resilient. They tend to come back. So burning during the correct time of year, during growing season, will help curb those things, help impact invasive species populations, and then continual burning is the key, right? So you got to keep doing it. Treating invasives is not a one-time thing. You got to continue to do it, and even then, it might still need to be paired with some other kind of project. Maybe you got to go in there and cut them down after it burns, or maybe you need to use some herbicide to spray. The fire opens that ground space up to where you can get in there and treat them. So it's not that magic bullet, especially for invasive species. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
What's the biggest fire you've ever been to?
The biggest fire I've ever been to. So, biggest fire I've been to date was probably one that we had this spring. We had March 20th, we had a red flag day. We had tons of fires burning all over the place. Probably could smell smoke for miles, and ended up in Page County that night. And the fire, all totality, was a complex incident. So it was actually a total of 5 separate fires burning. 3 of them ended up burning together, and 2 other ones were standalone incidences. The main fire was 7,000 acres. Another portion was 1,000. There was one that was 800, and then there was one that was 50. So that was the biggest, maybe most complex incident that I've been to and been part of.
One of the closest fires we've had in recent history is right up here on top of Afton Mountain. I know there was a truck, I think, or a truck and trailer combination that caused the fire.
Yep. I guess it was last fall, we had that fire on Afton Mountain. Started from a vehicle, pulled over on the side of the road, had some engine problems, caught on fire, and just the conditions were just right that it set the side of the hill on fire. And I think they ended up with 3 helicopters up there flying around and tons of resources. So it doesn't take much.
Maybe time for one more question. Right here.
I have 2 questions actually, but thank you first off for being here. You taught us a lot about fires. My first question is, what's like the smallest fire that you fought?
The smallest fire,
Yeah.
10 by 10 on the side of the road, so something as big as this podium.
And my other question is, how many lives have you saved from doing this?
How many lives have I saved?
Yes.
Gosh, I don't know. I try and think of it as structures. I try and tend to hope that people are smart, and if there's a fire, that they don't put their lives at risk. So I tend to think of structures and try and protect those. So hopefully a lot of those as well.
All right, well, please join me once again in thanking Cole Young. And I'm sure if you have further questions, he'd be happy to stick around, chat. Also, want to encourage you, if you have ideas for speakers in our next season, to let me know, or some of the others in the room, Max included. And thank you for coming tonight.